90% of consumers read online reviews before visiting a business. What do people see when they look you up online? We give you the tools you need to take control of your reputation. Send surveys to your customers via text message with Testimonial Collector. Get 5-star reviews on all the major platforms like Google, Yelp, and more. Track what people are saying about your business with Reputation Manager. Respond to comments and turn negative reviews into happy customers. See what your competitors' customers are saying about them with Competition Tracker. Learn great marketing tactics and what it takes to stay on top. A bigger social presence means more connections. Automatically generate and schedule engaging social media posts with Social 365. Build trust, boost sales, and grow your business.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. It is another Thursday, another great Thursday. So for everybody who has been so faithful to the show and you have been listening on one of your very many favorite podcast apps, I always say thank you. I appreciate you, even though I can't see you, but I do appreciate the comments that you make. You're visiting the website, entrepreneurlifeshow.com, that you go to the website, and some of you even ask for certain types of guests that I can get on the show. And if I haven't gotten them yet, I am working on them. I promise I'm doing my best to get some of these types of guests that you're looking for. But so far, we have had some really amazing guests on the show. So for those who are not familiar with the Entrepreneur Life Show, I'm Rose, your host. And I bring some fabulous guests. So if this is your first time watching or listening, make sure you check out the entrepreneurlifeshow.com website. It'll take you to all of the live stream platforms we are on: Twitch, Twitter, YouTube. If you're on YouTube, say hey in the chat room. If you're on Instagram watching, Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook, wherever you are, or if you just want to jump in from one of the podcast platforms. So I always want to start off by saying thank you to my very favorite sponsor, Marketing Out the Box. So if you want to get your marketing off the ground, get more visibility, check out Sean Maddox with Marketing Out the Box. That's www.marketingoutthebox.com with Sean Maddox. So who's on my show today? So if you haven't been to the website. So I'm really kind of excited. I'm not even going to say kind of excited. I'm looking forward to this show. I look forward to all the shows, but I'm really looking forward to this because I've never had this type of guest on the show. So when I found him, I was like, yeah, this is it right here. Because he is like a serial entrepreneur that has so many different types of ventures that he has touched base on or been a part of. Not just in the entertainment industry. Just so many different types of business ventures we're going to go through, and an author, as well as he has his own amazing podcast, as well as he actually has some courses. But we're going to get into the specifics of that, and I'm going to introduce him on the show. So this is Scott Edwards, the CEO, entrepreneur, professional MC. So yeah, we really want to jump in and hear about that. Author, yes, he has a book. As I said, I just want to emphasize that because when you check out his site, you're going to love it, and you're going to love what he has to offer. Has worked with some of the most influential comedians that we all know. If you don't know them, you're probably not from this planet. Leno, Seinfeld, Bob Saget. Love Bob Saget. He needs to be doing more right now. Dana Carvey, love Dana. I love them all, but those specifically, I've always kind of watched and followed. So of course, Scott will be able to give us kind of a take on his career journey and everything he has been doing. So I'm going to bring him up onto the show now so we can enjoy his journey and sharing all of his career stuff. Hey, how's it going? Thank you for being on the show.
Oh, so excited to be here, Rose. This is a new thing. I'm all these platforms and live. I should have dressed.
Well, you look lovely. You look lovely. So I have to tell you this. So when I did find you, I did go and I kind of
did your research.
Yes. And so I noticed that you have so many ventures, and I want to kind of get into them all. because you've done a variety of so many different things. I wanted to start off by, if you can just kind of share a little bit about maybe growing up as a youth, on what kind of transitioned you into being an entrepreneur, because you have so much experience and vast experience and the different things you've done.
Well, thanks for asking. And just to let the audience know, the reason she's asking this question, I've started over 12 successful companies. I've done everything from a small construction company to owning a submarine. So I've had a pretty diverse life, but it started as a normal, lower middle class upbringing, divorced parents when I was 10. I was working by the time I was 12. And I had my first real job, other than newspapers and stuff, when I was 15. Had to get an early driver's license so that I could raise money and help take care of my mom. But what really, I think, drove me to be an entrepreneur was two things. And that was I got fired from every job when I worked for somebody else. And
what kind of boss are you?
Yeah. And I wasn't a great student. So I went to Christian Brothers High School, and I was like a C average. I was just okay. And while my buddies were getting ready to go off to college, at age 17, I decided to start my own small construction company.
And construction actually is a background I started in. But how do you go from that to working with comedians in entertainment? This is two different kinds of genre. They're not even similar. It's not like being a cook and working in a restaurant and working at Burger King. You know what I'm saying? It's like they're two different 360.
Yeah, I think that for me, I just followed the path that life took me. So that first construction company, I was a janitor at a motel, and I was buffing floors, and I was only 17, but I snuck into the bar to just kind of hide from the boss. And I overheard two guys talking about making money on the weekends, striping lines in parking lots. Well, I didn't want to stay a night janitor at a motel. So I got a buddy that could buy a paint machine. I had another buddy that had a van to drive it around, and I was the sales guy. And we started A&A Restripe, our first small construction company. And we striped parking lots, all the McDonald's and Safeways and stuff.
Right.
And that kind of got me off on being my own boss. And I really enjoyed that, because you're responsible for your own success and you kind of make your own lifestyle. So I like being up late and sleeping in late, and that doesn't work with other jobs, but it works when you're the boss.
It works, but that brings me to then the comedy part, how you got involved in that, because that's actually staying up late, working late. That's what it is.
Right,
so,
exactly.
You've been involved in the entertainment industry in Hollywood, but especially in comedy and working with comedians, because that is such a competitive field, as well as, just how that whole circuit thing works. How did you even get involved in that?
Well, the reason I told the first story was, Rose, that it's so important for your listeners to understand that sometimes you have to just seize upon an opportunity, right? And so when I was a janitor and I overheard these guys, I was able to turn that into a business. So now we jump forward about 8 years, and I was selling life insurance. I was pretty successful, but I was a young kid telling people they were going to die soon, and did they want to buy a $5,000 policy where if you fell out of a plane on a Tuesday and landed in a certain kind of pine tree, it paid. And I was on vacation, and my father, who had a great sense of humor, said, "Hey, you got to go to this place. It's in Westwood, right near UCLA University. It's called the Comedy Store. Now, this is just a satellite room, but go by there. I think you'll enjoy it." And I had with me my girlfriend, soon to be wife, soon to be ex-wife. And we went into this Comedy Store, and we saw Sandra Bernhardt, Dave Coulier, and a number of other acts. And I was just sitting there, and I'm from Sacramento. We're a pretty small town, at least back then, very small town entertainment wise. And I go, man, this would do so well in Sacramento. I stayed until after the show, introduced myself to the acts, and started asking questions. And on the 6-hour drive home from LA to Sacramento, in my head, I had worked out how I could open my own comedy club. So the very next day, I quit my job. I went bankrupt, so I didn't have any debt, and started wheeling and dealing. I didn't have any money, but I wheeled and dealed my way into a banquet room of a restaurant. I stayed in communication with Dave Coulier, who introduced me to Bob Saget, who introduced me to Gary Shandling. And in August of 1980, yes, I'm that old, at the mere age of 24, I opened up Laughs Unlimited, the actual 12th, like that, comedy club in the entire United States. Now, keep in mind, this was before the big wave of comedy that, for during the 80s and the 90s, it was almost the rock and roll of the area. Comedy was hot.
Yeah.
And I opened my club in August of 80, and it was the 12th full-time comedy club in the country. And I was lucky enough to hook up with some of the names you mentioned, Bob Saget in particular, and Dave Coulier, who I leaned on to, I was just asking lots of questions. And then I met some of the owners of other clubs, Mitzi Shore, Bud Friedman, and I would ask them, how they got started and where do they get their talent. And they hooked me up. And it was just a lot of research. And then I just went for it. I opened my doors, and my very first act on stage was making $150 for the week. It was his first out-of-town gig out of Phoenix, Arizona, was Gary Shandling.
Yes, love him. And,
Yeah.
And I noticed you had a picture of yourself with a dress.
Yeah, Gary and I ended up being good friends. He worked for me for many years. He was only an opening act for a short time. He was soon headlining my club. Bob Saget was a regular, started off as a headliner and stayed working for me for many years, and Dave Coulier. But it went into Ray Romano, Jerry Seinfeld, Jay Leno. One of the really cool stories, Rose, was that back in the early 80s, a very young and inexperienced actor named Tom Hanks. You might have heard of him.
Yeah. Oh, no. Who doesn't know Tom Hanks? If you don't, I don't know what's wrong with people if they don't know Tom Hanks.
He had a TV show. His very first TV show was called Bosom Buddies.
Yes, I remember. I'm that old too.
Well, he had to do a stand-up set for the sitcom, and he was friends with Bob Saget. So Bob Saget brought Tom Hanks into my club, and for a week, Tom Hanks was my opening act, and I was teaching him the skills of how to be a stand-up, and Bob was helping him with material. And Tom Hanks worked my club for a week back in 1980.
Now bringing that up, like comedians in itself. So of course, you have to perfect your craft and everything, and that could take years. So, but I've always was curious, is this just coincidental or planning that the majority of really good sitcoms today and late night talk show hosts seem to be filled by comics or comedians? Now, I don't know if that is maybe when you start off and they're out on the circuit and doing their thing, that's the plan, or is it just coincidental and that is what the network looks for?
Well, it's not coincidental. I think that what it is to be a professional stand-up comedy, and we should make sure everybody knows that when Gary and Bob and Jerry and these guys, Jay Leno, were working for me, they weren't famous yet. They were doing basically their university training, the high level training to get discovered in what I call the golden ticket and get their own show or sitcom. And there was another 100 acts that were really good that never got the golden ticket that worked for me, that were really good comics. But to answer your question, the reason Hollywood likes comics is they are not an overnight success. In other words, you can't be spotted at a cafe and go, ooh, that's a perfect look, or that's a beautiful woman, I'm going to make her a star. Comics start off in the road and they learn their trade over years. Bob Saget did road comedy for many years before he became a star. Gary Shandling, same thing. Jerry Seinfeld, famous for working in the streets of New York for years. So when Hollywood gets them, they're already a honed artist.
Right.
They've put in the work, they've done the time, and they can. Well, let me teach you something, Rose. One of the reasons that comics make good actors is that when they're telling a bit on stage, the audience gets the sense that they just wrote it or just made it up. And the reality is they've probably produced and said that act 100 times on 100 other stages, but the acting comes in as they make it sound like they just thought of it. Oh, I was just in a plane. Well, he was probably in a plane 2 years ago, but he makes it sound like it just happened, and that's where the acting comes in. So not only are professional comics a honed artist when it comes to entertainment, but they can act like something is fresh and new, and that works really well for Hollywood.
I remember when, and maybe because I'm in my 50s, it just seemed like comedians could talk about anything and joke about anything, and it was funny because you can laugh at yourself and laugh at one another. And so, which I think that made it even funnier, because perfecting their craft is knowing how to make fun of you without hurting your feelings and being offensive, and it's still being funny. So now it just seems that so much has been taken away with culture, and people, you can't talk about weight. People are so sensitive, and because you have these courses, I want to just mention that. And being a host, how do you find or know that that's the right comic and still keeping your crowd? Because you're, of course, promoting and MC and training and knowing how to coach them and get them along with still people understanding the sensitivity of some people, how they might feel.
Well, that's a great point, Rose, that in this woke society, comics haven't changed. The society's view of things has changed, and it has made it more difficult. And yet on top of that, COVID, where people can't get on stage and work with things and practice, it's made it very difficult. But as you alluded to, I have a stand-up comedy course on my website, which is right there by my name, and it teaches how to take what you want to make your career from amateur to professional. And I think the secrets to success are being consistent and writing all the time, but be clean. Now, we all both know some very funny comics that made a career out of being kind of dirty on stage, but the vast majority, Dana Carvey, Jerry Seinfeld, Jay Leno, Bob Saget, well, he's not clean on stage, but he's clean on TV. Dave Coulier, Ray Romano, these guys mastered being funny and relatable and being clean. So I think these guys and that type of material, even in a woke society, is going to work because they're clean and they're working with how the audience relates to something. As you mentioned, you still feel comfortable because they're talking about experiences you've had. A great example that I've used as an analogy is one of Jerry Seinfeld's early bits was he had about a 3-minute bit about his dad's pajamas. And he goes, "What's with men's pajamas? It always looks like a suit. There's cuffs and a little chest pocket. You don't need a pocket protector in bed. You'll stab yourself, right?" Well, most people don't wear those pajamas anymore, but we all seen it on TV or on our dads, right? So, he's picking something that's very normal that we can all relate to, making it funny, and there's no way anybody in the audience is going to be offended talking about men's pajamas.
It seems like it leaves them limited in some cases, because they have to be cautious of that and people's sensitivity in the audience. So it must make your job, or I guess your skill in a sense, much more difficult, because you've been in the game for so long. You're having to change with the times of society when you're coaching in your courses.
Right. And I would think you've nailed it right there. It's not impossible, it's just more challenging. So you have to, oh, excuse me. So it's more challenging that you have to, expect what's going to happen when you're in front of a live audience. And you never know. What's interesting about all entertainers, whether you're a magician or a dancer or a singer, you don't know the audience you're going to get. And one of the really strong aptitudes for stand-up comics is a good one, a professional, is able to work his act no matter what the audience, if it's a room full of drunk teenagers or it's an Elks Lodge, right? They have to find a way to relate to that audience and make their material work. What's the same with this kind of woke society? It makes it more challenging, but it doesn't make it impossible. It just makes it, you just have to be aware of your audience. And that is a challenge, especially today. And I hope it changes.
Well, I know in your I was listening to one of your podcasts, and I know you were talking about one thing and timing, and it doesn't matter what your, I guess, what part of the industry you're in entertainment. It's about the timing and the presentation. And how difficult is that? Can you explain more, elaborate more on that?
Well, it is something that you can't necessarily map out like a mathematician might. What it is being fluid enough to adjust the timing of a bit to the audience. And I know that sounds a little like a difficult answer, but again, if you've got an audience of a bunch of people on their cell phones and they're not really paying attention, you have to adjust your material and slow down your pace so that you can get them paying attention to you and get them to understand the material. Whereas if you've got a really good poppin' New York audience that's with you, you can just breeze right through. One of the examples, and a guy that worked my stage twice, being able to do that was Robin Williams. He was somebody that no matter what the audience, his energy and his drive was so kinetic, it attracted the audience. They didn't want to miss anything. And he had a real gift for that.
If we can open up a little bit about your book.
Well, I've actually got 3 books out, but 2 of them are on comedy. One's called Be a Stand-Up Comic or Just Look Like One. And then I'm in the middle of publishing. It'll be out next month. A new one called 20 Answers to the Questions About Being a Stand-Up Comic. And it's a short, informational book on, again, if you want to get into comedy, what to expect and how to be a pro. I had lots of open mics at my clubs. I did a lot of comedy competitions. And there's a lot of people that say that they want to be stand-up comics, but it's a tough life. It's a tough world and a tough industry. And I try to be the voice of reality and say, look, I'll support you and help you get there, but it's going to be a long haul. And these are the things you need to do.
So do you think, when writing your books, is that something that can play a part in the course?
Oh yeah, they work hand in hand. In fact, my comedy course pretty much follows and includes a free copy of Be a Stand-Up Comic or Just Look Like One, because that book is the basics of what it takes to be a road comic, what work you can expect to do, and what you need to do to succeed. The second book, 20 Questions Answered, is about, okay, you're already a stand-up comic. How do I go from being an amateur or making $100 a week to maybe getting the golden ticket and getting a TV sitcom? There's 2 paths there, and I try to address both. And in fact, if your audience is interested in a free copy of the most recent book, have them go to my website and email me, and I'll send them a free copy just for you, Rose.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute. Free offer. Thank you.
So that being said, I wanted to go a little in about why you started the podcast, and of course, like the type of guests that you're bringing on the podcast, because I guess that kind of plays into because you're being a host and an MC, then of course hosting your own podcast.
Well, it's a little bit more involved than that, and it's pretty funny. And I hope she's listening because I told her to, I told all my friends I was going to be on Instagram, so hopefully she's watching. But my bride Jill, I spent 2 years as I get towards retirement. I spent 2 years writing my life story and how exciting and diverse my life has been as an entrepreneur. And my wife goes, "No one's going to read your frickin' book." It wasn't going to happen. So she said, "Why don't you do a podcast?" And this is about 2 years ago. And I go, "What's a podcast?" And of course, I knew what a podcast was, but I wasn't a listener. And so I started listening to podcasts, and I got involved in the industry, and I started my own podcast. And she was so smart because I own a lot of material from some very famous comics from back in the 80s and 90s before they were famous. And the podcast allows me to not only share that material, which is still very funny, but also I'm re-engaging with old friends, and I'm interviewing a lot of professional comics. And if you checked out the website and my podcast, by the way, the podcast is stand-up comedy, your host and MC, and I interview professional comics. In fact, just last Sunday, a great show, an interview with amazing Jonathan, who was one of the best comic magicians, had his own show in Vegas for 12 years. And it was an amazing interview, and it was great to reconnect with him. So check out the website, check out my podcast, and you'll learn a lot about comedy.
I want to kind of backtrack on something that you were talking about and owning material or having material, because right now you can't even play music and because it's not yours anymore. And then, it's easier today than it was before, I think, in the entertainment industry, because you used to have to try out, like send your resume and do all this stuff before you can even be considered as being seen or looked at. And so now it's just like all you need is YouTube. So because you were talking about, having ownership of, how does that work with comic stuff? Because you see people sometimes utilize, I've heard a joke before, but you make it your own. You know what I'm saying? So is that
right? We never want to encourage people to steal material, but after 50 years of stand-up comedy, almost no subject's been untouched. So
right.
if you hear material by a professional comic, it is okay to learn from that and maybe take a concept down the path that you see as funny. But we don't ever let anybody steal material. In this particular case, Rose, I was a producer. I did many stage shows, several concerts, and I also produced 3 TV series. So when you do that, you own the material because the comics sign away the waivers to allow me to utilize their material for my TV show or concerts. And so now, 40 years later, I still have access to that material with the permission of the comics. So it is something that comes from doing it professionally back in the 80s and 90s when I was producing the TV shows and concerts. I made sure I got the waivers. The comics understood that I was going to be sharing their material. Now, of course, we all thought at the time it would just be for those years that we were doing the shows, but it has moved on to more now with the podcast. Hey, well, that looks like a cool website. What's that?
I hope you don't mind. I just wanted to share that a little bit. So because you have so much going on with it, and for those who are listening, you can't see this, but if at some point in time you jump in onto the live, or you go to the website, which the interview will be there the whole time, then you can see what we're talking about with where you can get the courses, the books, the podcast. So if we can kind of like just for a minute, I hope you don't mind that I kind of bring that up a little bit to share it with people who are listening or watching.
No, I appreciate it, Rose. And there's actually, this is the original website, standupcomedyhostandmc.com. There's a new one called scottscomedystuff.com. And both offer an opportunity to see, to access all my old podcast. And you can see pictures. If you scroll down, you'll see pictures of some famous acts. There's my consulting. There's my book and an album and a CD I did. Scroll down a little bit more, and
you were quite young then. I mean, you look young now. But
that's Jerry Seinfeld and Yakov Smirnoff backstage at a concert I did with him.
Whatever happened to him?
Yakov?
Yeah.
I just interviewed him. He was in Bali. He's got his own theater in Branson, Missouri, and doing really well. But you can cruise through, and there's some pretty terrific pictures on there. I got a chance to go to the Tonight Show backstage several times. I was actually on the set of the Tonight Show with Jay Leno and my son. Tommy Chong of Cheech and Chong, the next picture, worked for me twice. Great entertainer. He autographed my album that I'd had, Big Bamboo, from back in the 70s. That was cool. There's a picture he did for us. He was great. He did Earache My Eye, a famous song by Cheech and Chong, live on stage, and that just gave me goosebumps. An early Jay Leno 8x10. This was when, quite a few years ago, Dave Coulier, when he was very young and handsome, he did a lot of work with us. Next is a copy of one of the tickets for the Cheech and for the Tommy Chong show he autographed for us. Yeah, so that was a lot of fun to have him at the club. But the website offers an opportunity to explore the podcast, see my 7 secrets of entrepreneurial success. That's a good one. My new book, my old book, and the online comedy course. And something that's brand new, Rose, that you may not have caught, is I have a new membership site where for a small fee, you can see all these famous entertainers performing live on stage through old videos. It's incredible.
And what site is that?
It's I'm not sure if it's on there, or if you got to go to Scott's comedystuff.com. Let's see, because it's mentioned the video.
I definitely want to make sure, and I love that you're on all kinds of podcast connection here, so I love that you have that, because I found that when you don't have that, it's hard to find. So people actually can just go right to the website, click on anything from Spotify, Overcast, Podchaser. You're all over the place.
Pandora, we're Stitchers, we're on all of them. And the podcast, I'm about to produce my 100th episode, so I'm very excited.
So tell us about how, what kind of guests you're having on the podcast. What can they look forward to, the listeners and stuff, and to go jump in and make sure they jump in on the podcast?
So thanks, Rose. Every other week I do something different. On the first week, it's a sharing actual live comedy sets from back in the day from my TV shows and stuff. And you'll find that the comedy is a little more raw, but it's also really funny and fresh in the sense that it still works. A joke that was funny in 1988 is still funny today. If it's done correctly by a professional. And then the other week or podcast is these interviews. And as I said, I've interviewed Yakov Smirnoff, Amazing Jonathan, Steve Bruner, one of the funniest comics still out there working the road, Will Schreiner, who's had his own shows, Larry Bubbles Brown, who's famous in the Bay Area. So a lot of famous and not so famous comics I've had a chance to re-engage with and interview. And what's nice about it is not only do we talk about the old days and how they came to work for me, but we talk about what they're up to now. And it's interesting because some of them are still doing comedy, but most of them have transitioned. They're public speakers or motivational speakers, or they're authors, or or accountants. I don't know. I mean, it's a little bit of everything.
Well, I have found that it's to me, what I've seen is common that you have your comics that start off in comedy. I mean, and they're on the road. They're and they're doing their stand up everywhere. but then you see them on TV, but they seem to maneuver back if they're not in television and movies to going back on stage. And which is lovely, because to me, I can watch certain shows over and over and over again. I can watch Lucy over and over again. I can watch David Seinfeld over and over again, because it seems like even though you watch the rerun, there's something that you always miss that makes it still funny.
Yeah, and I think that you've hit a good point in what I was trying to say about the podcast and my old shows and the video membership I'm offering, is that even though a lot of the material you're hearing is from the 80s and the 90s, it's still funny because it relates to the audience.
Yeah.
One of my favorite interviews, and guys on stage, he was considered the bulldog of comedy, Bobby Slayton. I don't know if you've ever seen Bobby Slayton, but he's the kind of guy that would be really challenged with a woke audience, because his act was very hard hitting and interactive with the audience, and it made him very funny, and people loved him. But there was nothing woke about him. He was a very dramatic and reaching into people's lives. It was amazing. Check out, have your people go to the Googler and do Bobby Slayton. They'll enjoy him.
How difficult was it for you to actually, bring the hurdles in starting, the whole platform for comedian and opening a comedy club? What are some of the difficulties? I'm sure they're different now than today, because you don't see as many today.
Right. When I opened, there was only 12 clubs, but it caught on like a rock and roll wave is the example we use. By 1986, 6 years after I opened, it was like Starbucks. There was a comedy club in every corner. All the discos from the 70s converted to comedy clubs. But then by about 1992, most of those had gone away. So it was about a decade-long wave, maybe 12 years. And I was able to ride that wave and really had a good time. But to go to the difficulties of starting a comedy club, I would say that it's all about doing your research. So I had already started 2 companies previously. And I know how to start a company. That was easy for me. I'd never been a producer, but people like Bob Saget and Gary Shandling kind of taught me what it needs to be done to run a professional show. But I think what made me successful in all my businesses, and there's been over a dozen, was that I'm not afraid to ask. If you want to go into construction, go to a guy that owns a construction company and ask him how he got into it and what he likes about it and what he doesn't like about it. And you know what? 9 times out of 10, they're going to tell their story to you. In the case of comedy, I was going to comics and other club owners, and I was not afraid to go up and say, hey, what makes a comedy show work? Or what should I be paying you? I would ask the comics, what should you get paid? And what was great was they weren't like, oh, well, pay us $10,000. No, they were like, well, if you're an opening act, you make this. If you're a feature, you make this. And if you're a headliner, you make this. And they were honest with me. And those were the guidelines that I used. But it all came from talking to people and not being afraid to research and really delve into the industry that I was interested in. I did the same when I opened restaurants. I did the same when I opened art galleries. It was, I think that's good advice for anybody. The other thing, Rose, I'm going to jump into this, that is important about being an entrepreneur is so many people procrastinate. They talk about they want to do something and they go on and on and on and they never do it. It's the same in podcasting. And Walt Disney once famously said, stop talking about it and start doing it. And that's the key to being an entrepreneur. You don't just talk about opening a business, you open the business and learn as you go.
So do you think, is there any one specific comic or comedian that you can say really didn't, he wasn't given enough credit for what he does? And I only bring up Bob Saget because I remember seeing, the whole biography and on the show. And so, but I had always liked him, and it seemed like he was pushed to hold back a lot. And so
Well, Bob is, for those that don't know, he's famously on TV in Full House is Mr.
Right.
Clean Dad. The reality is that he was one of the filthiest comics I ever had on my stage. And what a lot of people don't know, he's a really good musician, and he used to sing a lot on stage. And by the way, if you go to my membership, you'll see videos of him doing early comedy and singing. But he had a whole lot of talent. And what Full House did is it changed how the public saw him. So he worked for me after Full House came out. And we would get these calls, and the people would say, we want to bring our 10-year-old daughter in. We're like, no. You know, he's different on stage than he is on TV. and that's something that he's been able to manage his whole life. Anyway, Bob Saget was a tremendous support and friend to me in the beginning. In fact, my first 2 TV commercials, he co-starred in and directed for me.
Wow, I always wonder certain comedians what they're doing that I still follow. And so being that you are being, the host, and of course it being basically your comedy show, how much freedom do they have? How much, is there things where you say, you know what, but you can't do that?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, Rose, because on the one part, as the producer of the show, I have expectations of my entertainers fitting a certain agenda. I'll make it, give you a great example. I did these free concerts called Laughs in the Park. The largest one had 12,000 people, and they were families. So kids were there. So we had jugglers and we had clowns for the kids, but then we had professional stand-up comics doing material. And stand-up comedy is kind of the last bastion of free speech. So you can't really tell an entertainer, a stand-up comic anyway, you cannot do this, because that kind of breaks the whole world of comedy. However, I could say, hey, we're doing a family type concert. I need you to give me 5 clean minutes. We don't want any swearing, no F-bombs, and do the material that you think this 12,000 people of families and kids can relate to. And 9 times out of 10, the entertainers would follow that guideline. Now, there was always one guy that would go, well, I'm going to do what I want to do, and he'll drop an F-bomb or something, and we just, that's the nature of comedy. Now, on stage, we would rarely tell an act that he couldn't do something, because that's again not done. Comedy is the last bastion of free speech, and comics kind of get away with what they want. Now, I will say that I've had lots of comics that came and worked my stage, and they were dirty and not funny. And even though they felt like they had a message to get out, I never hired them again, or I never hired them if they showcased, right? So I, as the producer, controlled what went on my stage.
Have you ever been in a situation, or have seen or known of a situation where you have comedians on stage and somebody had just did some, like, some joke or of someone else, and they're like, I was just going to do that?
Well, there's sometimes a crossover. I always tell comics to watch the other comics in their show so they don't step on each other's material. And whoever gets up on stage first usually gets the shot at that material. So sometimes what's good about that is an opening actor, like an amateur, and a feature act, which has got some experience, might do a joke about a car breaking down. What's great is a headliner is so professional and has so much material, it's not a big deal for him not to do his joke about a car breaking down. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes complete sense.
And it would be a lot harder to tell the opening act, hey, don't do that bit about a car breaking down, because that might be the only bit he has.
Yeah. Okay, so what advice would you give that most up and coming people who want to get in the industry that they make it's common, or that they, that you can tell them it's not a good idea, or like kind of the path to take?
Well, go to my comedy course. It'll teach you. But the short answer is you have to, like any business, Rose, and you've talked to a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of people that have been driven. What is the secret sauce to success? And I think it's having a passion for what you want to do. So in your case, you have a passion for numbers, and that makes you a good bookkeeper and accountant. Somebody else has a passion for insurance, and you might have an insurance agency. I know that sounds ridiculous, but there's people that have those interests. So in comedy, much like dancing or magic or juggling, you have to have a passion and be willing to go through the hard, difficult parts to make it to the successful part. And what makes somebody go from amateur to professional, and that's having the consistency, the stick-to-itiveness, and the passion to succeed. It's like being an author. You can't just sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write a book. You have to want to write a book. It's a lot of work.
How long is your course, or what does your course kind of consist of? And I'm sure at some point in time, I don't know, I'm going to assume that you have probably run into someone and said, I don't think this isn't for them. Well, how do they get involved in your course?
Well, it's interesting because my course is a course on the reality of stand-up comedy. So I would say the first 2 or 3 lessons in the course are like, hey, this is a tough business. This is going to be a lot of work. You may not want to do this, right? Because we're trying to challenge the student to, is this a path that you are willing to take? And then if they keep going through the course, they go, that's because they have the passion, because they have the drive to complete it. They will then, the book and the course transitions to, okay, you're serious. Here's what you really need to know. How to use a mic, where to stand on stage, how to interact with an audience. What happens if you get a heckler? What if you bomb, right? I mean, people go, what if I bomb on stage? Well, join the club. We've all bombed. Jerry Seinfeld has bombed on stage. Bob Saget has bombed. Everybody in the industry has had a bad show or a bad month or a bad year. It's all about being passionate and pushing through it and keep driving, because you learn like anything else. If you want to be a doctor, you don't just get a degree in your doctor. You got to practice, right? It's the same with anything, dancing, juggling, magic, all the art forms, including stand-up comedy. It's get on stage, because each and every time you learn something. So if there is something that I could share, free advice for your audience, if you're interested in being anything, but especially a stand-up comedy, go and do it. Stop talking about it. Go do it. Find an open mic, find a stage, get up there. And I'll tell you, the sense of joy that you get when you connect with an audience. Now, I'm not a comic, but I've been on stage more than most comics as a professional MC. I emceed all my shows for over 21 years, 6 nights a week. So I've had a lot of stage time, and I've bombed plenty. But it's about that interaction, that sense of energy you get from the audience is so amazing. The high, I mean, it is almost like a drug. You love it, you miss it when you don't get it. And that's why a lot of entertainers are insecure. I'm sure you've heard this, basically insecure, because they get on stage and they feel that love and they feel that energy when they connect with an audience. There's nothing like it. It's amazing.
Now, I'm thinking that you, as being the host, the promoter, the professional MC, you still have to be funny yourself or connect yourself. So, and you have to have a thick skin, because people are really waiting for the show. And then when you get to who opens the show, then they're really waiting for who's coming on last, because that's going to be the one that, you're really coming there for. So how much pressure do you think you feel because I would think you have to get, it's like, what do they call the hype man? You have to get the people in the audience ready for everybody else.
Right. That's the job of a producer and a professional MC, is to get the audience focused get them quiet, and at the same time energized for what's coming. So I would always open my show saying, hey, coming up in a little bit is Bob Saget, so get ready for that. But in the meantime, our feature act is Ray Engen out of the Bay Area. And coming up right now, somebody to kind of get you focused, get you excited, our first act to warm you up is, somebody else. And you're right, the job as the MC is really difficult. I mean, to me, it's not difficult because I just love it, but it is hard because when I go up, they're all just sitting and talking and drinking, right? I have to kind of like do some announcements, do a couple little jokes, get them focused. Some people said I was funny. I never considered myself a comic, but there's kind of an industry joke that Scott Edwards can easily do a half hour warming up as an MC. Which is not my job, but I love the stage just like they do. And if I got rolling with an audience, it just takes over. It's fun, but it is hard, and you get used to it. And I got to tell you, I was sucked in the beginning. I wore a 3-piece suit, and I was like I saw on TV. I was going to be an MC like you saw on TV. Hi, welcome to the show. I was very stiff. But 21 years, that'll work it out of you.
Well, I want to really thank you because this was such an insightful show. Because I've never, ever had anybody who has worked with comedians, who especially so closely, because it's different between being a comedian. You can see the outside of how it works, as well as the inside of how it works. And then as well as being an entrepreneur, totally separate in the field of being in the entertainment industry.
Yeah, and your show was all about being an entrepreneur. And like I said, I went from a construction company to being a portable music DJ to the comedy clubs. But after that, I had a travel agency. I owned a Submarine, a beach shack in Hawaii, and I just sold my insurance agency. So when I get interested in something, I jump in with both feet and I make it work. When I had the comedy clubs, all comedy clubs are not just entertainment. You have to have a bar. You have to serve food. So that got me into the restaurant industry. I mean, you learn as you go. And my advice to everybody, again, is if you're thinking about doing something, whether it's a podcast or a business, do your research and then jump in with both feet, because what's the worst that can happen is you can fail. And hey, failures are the stepping stones to success.
Before we close out the show, I just want to ask, what did you do with the submarine? What?
Well, I'll try to give you the short version of the story. I was the co-owner of a great company called Snuba. Anybody that's traveled the world, you've seen it in Mexico, Hawaii, in Japan. Snuba is underwater snorkeling. And I became really good buddies with the guys that own Snuba. And they built a submarine called the Nautilus One for Hawaii. It was a tourist submarine. And I said, wow, I want one of those. So I had a submarine built called the Nautilus 4. I was the fourth one. And we put it in Monterey, California. And it ran for about a year and a half. It was a tourist submarine. And we were showing people the kelp forest and the sea otters and the sea lions. But it failed. That was one of my big losers. The water was too cold in Monterey. We had a problem with algae bloom. People couldn't see that much. We ended up selling the submarine to the Wrigley Gum family, and it still operates in Catalina Island. But I owned a submarine for about a year and a half, and that's the short version of the story.
That's a pretty good story.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I mean, how many people could say that?
Yeah, a submarine of all things.
Yes.
So, of course, everybody who has been listening on one of your streaming platforms, I really hope you're entertained by today's guest. And I want to also make sure that you watch the interview live so you can make sure that if you are really interested and you want to know more about comedy and how you can get involved and just the ins and outs of everything. And then you're going to learn something professionally in business at the same time. And maybe we'll be watching you on TV. So you want to make sure that you get a hold of Scott. It's scottscomedystuff.com. You can, if you've forgotten anything, we showed his website. go to entrepreneurlifeshow.com. It is going to be there for live. The video, you can watch the live interview as well as connect, but I want to make sure that Scott tells you every place that he is before we leave the show. But remember, if you forget, you can always jump in on the website, entrepreneurlifeshow.com. So if you don't mind kind of giving our listeners your exit to make sure they get a hold of you.
Well, first off, let's say, Rose, you're doing a great job with your podcast, connecting with your audience in so many different ways and sharing such great stories and information. Everybody, let's hear it for Rose.
Yes.
Good job. Good job. She's rocking it. And I want to thank you for having me on today. It's been such an honor, and you've had great questions, and we dug a little deeper than usual on the comedy side. For anybody listening, go to scottscomedystuff.com. You'll find my online comedy course, access to my CDs and books, and also my new video membership, which is a great way to see some of the classics, famous and not so famous, comics performing live on stage. I'm Scott Edwards, your host and MC.
We will see you next time, everybody. Bye. Till the next show.